Chapter 14. The Grizzly. Another wolf skin hung on the wall of the main room in the ranch house, the largest one of the three there, and once more Reddy was the star in a story which went from ranch to ranch, and then from town to town. It was linked with that of the mountain lions, and later of the coyotes, and it made Reddy, more firmly than ever, the greatest hound in the foothill country. The ranches were, for the most part, rugged men who appreciated rugged dogs, and here was one in their midst that certainly knew no equal. It was natural that many tried to find new fields for him to conquer. Reddy, however, when fully recovered from his wounds, went his way unconcernedly, faithful only to Johnny, from whom he was never willingly separated. He liked everyone at the ranch, but he loved the ranger with an unswerving devotion. When Johnny rode around the ranch, the red hound could always be seen, either ranging a short distance ahead or following directly at his horse's heels, tail up, and long ears set well forward as he looked around him for possible foes. He'd quickly learned which animals to hunt and which to leave alone. The pronghorn antelope, which bounded away on all sides, were never molested. Badgers, the diggers of burrows and dangerous to the legs of all the hooved animals, he chased and disposed of at every opportunity. Coyotes he hated more and more, though they and the bobcats were very scarce now. Sometimes Johnny would ride to the top of a butte and sit there for hours studying the cattle herds and the bands of horses through his binoculars. On such occasions, Reddy would stand or sit on his haunches, looking just as intently at his master, ready at any moment to go charging over the prairie in pursuit of any predator that they found skulking around the valuable stock. Few sheep and fewer calves were lost on the ranch that summer. The black and tans took life much easier. They hung around the ranch house and confined their major activities to chasing jackrabbits and the occasional cottontail. Once during early September, a grizzly ventured from the timber to the sagebrush country and caught a young steer. Grizzlies were so scarce in the Wyoming that this incident created quite a stir, especially when it was learned from the tracks that this one was none other than old Thimbletoes, who came only very occasionally from the mountains, and who several years before had lost two of his big claws in a steel trap. Thimbletoes was an almost legendary character. Hunters had been after him for many seasons, though none had managed to even come near the great lumbering old fellow, who was a constant traveler and went from one district to another, always to return when least expected. It was said that he weighed 1,000 pounds and was at least 20 years old, though all of this was just mere guesswork. The big bear had one virtue, which in fact was a weakness. He hated to waste meat. When he managed to kill a beef or an elk, which wasn't very often, he came back to the carcass again and again until nothing was left, except a few of the bigger bones. With these he would sometimes play like a child, tossing them into the air and catching them deftly, rolling on his furry back with one of them juggled between his great paws. Several times he'd been hunted hard with hounds, and on each occasion he managed to escape after inflicting losses to the pack, so the owners held back from risking any more valuable dogs. At least, that was the case until Johnny was induced to take up the hunt with Reddy, the argument being that the steers and cows were worth considerable money to the ranchers, who in hard times could ill afford to feed them, to the bears or any other predators. The game authorities might object, but some of the ranchers took the stand that the steer-killing grizzly was outside of the game laws and had to go. The hunt grew into a big affair, more on account of curiosity than anything else. People wanted to see the notorious red hound in action against the most formidable foe that could be found. The grizzly was still paying nightly visits to the steer's carcass when Reddy was brought to the scene early one morning. There was a number of men on horseback armed to the teeth, and some more in automobiles, waiting nearly a mile away from the kill, as Johnny came with the hound by car and was led to the fateful spot. It was marked by bones, red hide, and trampled ground in the shadow of one of the many buttes. Tension grew among the picturesque crowd as the hound was led out. Skeptics shook their heads. Several offered bets against him. Johnny, however, quietly walked to the trampled ground and stood watching, while Reddy examined the bones and looked the place over with evident interest, but no excitement. All that he smelled was grizzly bear, not mountain lion, coyote, bobcat, or even badger. He was disappointed, and he showed it. No one had ever encouraged him to hunt bears. The buzz of comments came from the circle of men. They'd half expected that something like this would happen. Some of them were mean enough to exult. Johnny, however, just stood there as silent as ever. Presently Reddy came back from his tour of investigation and stopped in front of his master for directions. Inquiringly, he looked at the ranger's face, trying to read it, for he knew very well that something was expected of him. Johnny waited until the other men, in their disappointment, had made plenty of unpleasant remarks. And then, with a confident smile, he stepped forward and pointed out the bear's tracks to the hound, talking to him, meanwhile, in the way that Reddy understood, telling him to hunt what he smelled there on all sides, bear. And Reddy was quick in getting the idea that at last he was expected to trail a grizzly, this one that had left heavily scented tracks during the night before. So with tail wagging, he went to work on the scent, trying to unravel the trail and find the direction that the bear had taken. Soon he began to circle and gradually drift toward the mountains. Almost before the watchers realized what was happening, he was a quarter of a mile away and giving tongue. They didn't argue or bet anymore. One and all they started after him, on their horses, some of them, with the younger ones, adding color to the occasion by giving Apache war whoops with great gusto. That was the beginning of a grueling run. Such a chase in the mountains as none of them had ever experienced before. It lasted all that day and night, and all the day following, and ended in Yellowstone Park, where a guard found Reddy baying all by himself at the big bear who'd been chased and harried and nipped until, unable to go any farther, had stopped with his back against a protecting cliff. The ranchmen, with the exception of Johnny, had long since turned back, after being left far behind among the rocks and canyons. Johnny had kept going, but lost the trail eventually among the peaks. The hound was unhurt and seemed fit as when he started. In fact, he was so determined to fight that the park guard could scarcely drive him away. Again and again, Reddy, bristling all over, came back to attack, and as many times was chased and threatened by the guard, who did not wish to harm him, but was duty-bound to protect the bears in the park from being either injured or molested. Had Johnny been able to come to his aid, Reddy would not have allowed anyone to drive him away. But without Johnny, he knew himself powerless to dispute the authority of man, and so he had to give in. At first he stayed nearby and waited for the guard to leave or for Johnny to come, but at last he realized there was no use in hanging around the bear any longer. So reluctantly, with many stops and backward glances, he left the grim animal and started slowly along the road back home. Before dark he happened to come across Johnny's trail, and at once he changed direction and followed it, until he found the ranger making a bed of leaves and spruce twigs for himself in a cave, where he'd built a fire of dry dead limbs torn from nearby trees, and expected to spend the night. Johnny had shot a large blue grouse with his rifle, and had plucked it and spitted it for cooking. Man and dog looked at each other understandingly for a long time, across that little fire that evening. They shared the grouse evenly and lay down together, very tired, but quite contented with the world, the way old pals stuck by each other. The bear, to be sure, had escaped, but not from any error of theirs. Besides, after such an experience, it was unlikely that he would dare come back for a long time, if at all. Johnny could pretty well piece together in his mind the chase as it actually occurred. He could imagine Reddy slowly working on the shale, finding the stale trail until he came upon the bear sleeping in some thicket or near a timber line from which it burst when aroused, with the hound roaring close behind, trying his best to bite the powerful flanks, to make it stop and stand at bay until the hunters could catch up. After running until winded and thoroughly mad, the great bear no doubt stopped often to turn and try to catch the hound, who was nimble enough to dodge the rushes, and harass the big beast until in a fury it would start off again, clattering over rock slides, crashing through brushes, but always instinctively going further from the pursuing hunters and nearer a well-known sanctuary. Johnny guessed that this might be the park. He'd worried more than ever before about Reddy, and had made more than one solemn vow to never start him again after an old grizzly like Thimbletoes, in country where horses could not follow and bring aid, or men on foot couldn't keep within hearing. The danger to the hound was just too great. Sleeping beside the remains of the fire that night, Reddy growled in his dreams, and once more rushed over the rocks and down the gloomy canyons behind his big adversary. But with him was the black wolf. When the two forced the bear to turn and fight, and the animal stood facing them with teeth bared, the wolf suddenly vanished, and Reddy was left alone once more and could not find the king. No matter how long he waited and later searched, in his loneliness he awoke, and then stood for a time at the cave's mouth looking out at the starlit mountains. Impelled by his feelings, he gave the long, wailing, lonesome call of the wolves. It carried far and wide over the valleys and filled the cave until Johnny was wakened and came over to him. But Johnny understood. He said no word and let the hound howl and howl. Presently coyotes answered far over and to the left, and then to the right. Bull elk bugled somewhere in the wooded valleys, and the usually quiet mountains, now wakened, seemed all at once to be full of animal life. But man and dog listened in vain for any answering call of a big wolf. Johnny, once more on his rough bed, thought hard about this, and made up his mind some day to take Reddy back to the Athabasca, perhaps to the very spot where he'd lived so contentedly in the cabin. Good old Mac was still at the railroad station, lonely no doubt, but proud as ever of his castle. And somewhere in the highest mountains, the black wolf would be roaming, perhaps hoping to find his old comrade. Yes, someday, thought Johnny, and he too became suddenly very homesick. End of chapter 14.